Cool. Okay, I think we have critical mass, so we will go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Sounds like a yes. All right. So the agenda for today, I want to start with the priorities that the team is focused on right now. So everyone contributing to the protocol. So first priority is permissionless hubs. We're mostly there. There's some set of stabilization work that is like either mid-flight or almost about to be shipped that will get us to a pretty good place. And once that's done, I think we can call permissionless hubs in a really good place. The second priority is permissionless signups. So this actually means getting the contracts to mainnet and getting to a place where two things are possible. One is any app developer can invite any user. So you have full control over the invite and onboarding flow and you can bring people on. Two, app developers have reasonable mechanisms to protect themselves from spamming users and spammy signups so that there's no flooding that you have to deal with, which you see as a problem on Lens and other protocols. So those two things we want to achieve. And the third priority, whatever time we have left, is spent on new features. So these are extensions to the hubs, things that add new things that people are asking for, like David's proposal for some communities, some of our ideas for ENS support, and et cetera. And so that will be sort of third on the priority stack in terms of how we tackle it. Any questions on that before I jump straight into the actual items on the agenda? No? Okay, awesome. So first question, the first thing that the team is focused on, and Shane has been driving a lot of the work on this, is developer experience for the hubs, particularly Hubble. So two things that are worth calling out. One is we have this new example replication to Postgres. So if you're trying to get hubs to sync to a database, Shane is a really good example for how to do it with like a Docker container, and he has some nice patterns in here. You might be able to take this and use it in your environment directly. You might just be able to copy some of this code and modify it if you're using slightly different databases or slightly different deployments. And it's pretty good. It's probably not going to handle like crazy scale, but it's a very good starting point for you to say, hey, I have a hub and I have a database, and these two things connect and work pretty well together. So play around with this if you haven't. It took me like 10 minutes to get this set up, and everything like ended up working fine for me. But we would love feedback on this, particularly if we can get any of this stuff improved. So this is the first thing that we shipped. The second thing that we're working on is Dockerized deployments. So right now you have kind of this like annoying process where you have to like sync the hubs, check out the repo and run it. And in the future, every deployment will just have a new Docker container. So you can just download the latest Docker container, hit a button, and then have it stood up and have it running. So Shane's working on that. Expect that to ship maybe as early as tomorrow or early next week. And I'll nudge all of y'all who are running hubs to upgrade your hubs to work on the new things. The third thing, and I wanted to take, I'm going to do a more formal survey in using Google Docs or Google Forms, but I wanted to check in on this call and see, are there things around the hub experience that we could be improving that we should be working on right now? Or are there pain points that you have where you're like, hey, this is really annoying and I wish this part worked better? And I'll pause here for a minute to see if people have suggestions. Feel free to drop in chat or unmute and talk on chat as well. Okay, last call. Cool. Everyone is happy with the state of hubs. Great. We will continue getting feedback async because I'm sure there's still things that are broken. But if you think of any things after this call, feel free to DM me on Telegram or whatever. We want to keep really like doubling down on this until hubs are like super easy for everyone to get up and running. 3 more FIPs that are important to get
on your 1D.
Sorry, what was that, Jason?
Sorry, on your 1D, if you're still using Workcast APIs, what's the blocker?
Yep.
I'd say the only blocker on our side is just time and competing priorities. And we're on the error stack side of our business, we're going to be running hubs, and we'll be doing for Jam and for others as well. What would you say is in your ideal world, like drop dead last call for like getting off the Workcast APIs? Like, so if I would like to say, okay, like we want to prioritize do as soon as possible, but like, by this date, if you're not off it, it's like too late for you guys.
So I'll give you the answer from the Farcaster protocol perspective and the Workcast perspective, right? So from the protocol perspective, we just want to make sure all the apps are well supported and that they're actually able to migrate off of Warpcast because we don't want any dependencies there. So let's say Warpcast says, hey, we're not going to support these APIs over the end of the year. If some application decides to start migrating at the end of the year, and then they're like, hey, we need X, Y, and Z on hubs, there's probably not going to be enough time to actually get all of that done, and that puts everyone at risk. So from our perspective, earlier the better, especially if we can get feedback on things that are not working. But we're not going to force anyone to upgrade. We're not going to nudge anyone to upgrade. And then from the Warpcast perspective, I think the implicit thing is, hey, we'll support it to the end of the year. And we hope that we will try to nudge someone in the community who's actually interested in running an API business to start this independently. Again, just to move the center of gravity away from Warpcast, but also because it's actually a good business. It's sort of like an alchemy for the space and people can run them. And we'll try to get that up and running by the end of the year.
Varun, just maybe to reiterate from like the Warpcast perspective, we do not want to be in the business of APIs. Like we don't want to do billing. We are strictly providing that. Like A, it was an interim solution, and B, it's like a decent getting started experience if you don't want to deal with the hub. But in an ideal world, like both from protocol perspective and the Warpcast perspective, we have multiple companies that are offering amazing developer experience so that you just abstract away as much from hubs and fee generation and all that other kind of stuff. Like we would be very happy to shut off like public API access to Warpcast if there were a reasonable set of solutions. And so like I want to be really clear in the market. There's no like, oh, well, other people start building it and then it's like taking off. It's like, we're going to get into the business like that. Our strategy is build the protocol and build the best possible client with Warpcast because we think that's good for the protocol. And Varun, correct me if I'm wrong. Like there's no other part of the strategy where it's like we want to be the best developer platform.
Yeah, I'm like really practical. Like we have right now from Airstack APIs enable you for any Ethereum address to look up the Farcaster username, ENS name, your domains, the primary domain, and then now Lens as well. And a lot of folks are really interested in that. They're finding it like super compelling. And like today, for instance, we had all these people who had been building on Lens who had never talked to us before. Like, oh wow, now we can build things that connect to Farcaster and ENS and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And relying on the Warpcast APIs for that, but we want to move off it, right? We just want to say that you could all be coming from hubs. That's the only thing really that we're using the Warpcast APIs for on the Airstack side. So I was just trying to think like, I can tell the team, all right, let's get it done in the next 2 weeks or get it done the next month and a half. In my mind, it was never like rest of the year. So we'll be quick to move off it.
Okay. I think within, if it's like within 2 to 6 weeks, I think that's a very reasonable time frame. The biggest thing I want to make sure is like, in an ideal world, you guys just move to hubs and everything's magical and you're like, this is great. But I think in the real world, when you move, you will find some things that were lacking or that are broken or whatnot. And we just want to get that feedback as soon as possible so we can get stuff fixed for y'all. Cool. Alex Payton, I know you mentioned that you're using Python. So Mircha actually wrote a 80% complete Python SDK for hubs. I think it's like mostly there. I'll try to drop it in the chat after this call once I look it up, but hopefully you can start playing around with them at least. And I know Mason Hall in the Farcaster Pi channel was talking about potentially porting this. I think if it was important to you and you want to like nudge him, I'm sure he'd be happy to actually go work on on picking this up. I don't think Mircha's actively developing this. I think he just built a proof of concept. So we do need someone to take ownership of this Python library at some point. Cool. All right. So I'll keep moving down this list. So first proposal is multi-signatures. We already brought this up last time. I won't go into this in too much detail because it's fairly technical, but we are planning to ship this change. It should have no impact on app developers or anyone else. The nice thing about this proposal is in the future, when you're an app that's hosting users and they're using like, call it address 1, 2, 3 on the blockchain to store their identity, and they want to move it to address 4, 5, 6. This offers a way for you to broadcast signatures from the new address ahead of time and then do the migration so there's no disruption to the user's account. Whereas if you do this today, what will happen is all their messages will get deleted. You'll re-sign all of them and you'll resend them and they'll all get settled again and create a lot of thrash on the network. So this sort of offers smooth transition between names without any disruption to the user's data. So that should go out on this version. And again, no impact on developers, APIs, or anything like that. Super, super low level change. Second thing is canonical serialization. So Sanjay, who's on the call, actually worked on this one. So the high level problem that we had before was it was actually hard to write hub SDKs in other languages because the way we were doing signing was very dependent on the way a TypeScript gRPC library worked. And Sanjay's got this proposal that is mostly backwards compatible that will go out. And when this is out, you'll be able to like serialize using any library in any language, and it should all work reasonably well. So if you are maintaining a library in some language, like if you're planning on writing Python or Golang or whatever, just reach out to us when this launches. We're happy to work with you and figure out how to like implement the last details. But this should unblock people and let them write their own libraries in whatever language they choose. Third one is links. So I brought this up yesterday, but let me just quickly summarize this. So the general idea behind links is we want a way for people to establish like their social graph between each other. So links offer a super flexible way of establishing different relationships. You can have a person following another person, a person endorsing another person, and with a small upgrade in the future, you could even have a person creating links to non-user objects like contracts and other things in the protocol. So it's a very flexible standard. Warpcast plans to publish follow links. So there will be links and there's like a little string where you can say what type it is. And Warpcast will publish all their follows, follows as follow links. And there's also flexibility if other applications want to start playing around with different types of links. Warpcast doesn't have any plans to do anything other than that right now. But from the Farcaster perspective, people can start playing around with different types of links, and you can even coordinate on what these links mean, et cetera, et cetera. We picked a limit of 2,500 from them just after doing a lot of analysis on the network. I think that maybe less than 0.6% of people will be affected by this. And for most of those people, again, there are reasonable experiences that apps can offer, such as pruning old users that are no longer active, or offering a global feed, which will work for some small set of users like bots that want to subscribe globally. So I think this will be like minimally disruptive to everyone today and will preserve most valuable follows of the network. Couple of questions that people have had. Let me just jump to this because these may come up. What are the incentives to publish? I think the incentives are weaker than casts, but there are incentives for that application developers can create over time for people to publish their follows, such as saying, hey, if you've actually established and maintained follow relationships, we might, boost your content more because you're clearly like actively following and subscribing to people. Some users may do airdrops to their followers, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of different schemes. The protocol is not opinionated on what they should be, but there are ways to do it. And we're open to the fact that if this, a year from now is not working, we can roll this back and try to play with a new model and whatnot. But we have pretty high confidence that, at least for now, with Warpcast publishing data and others reading data, that this will actually be a pretty good data set. One other thing, like why not extend reactions? So the main reason that links are a separate type is that reactions have a time-based expiration, which the nice thing about a time-based expiration is it lets us store much more data because we know the data expires faster, so we can offer more reactions. Whereas with links, you often don't want them to expire. You want to keep them around until they're no longer valuable. And so the non-expiring property is very important for links, and so we separated them for reactions. Third thing is, reactions have a narrow type. Like reactions can only be one of two types, recasts or likes. Whereas follows have this interesting proposal where they can be any type. They're just a string and you can kind of put whatever you wanted there. We wanted to play around with this new, more flexible type as kind of part of our Turing complete model and see what emerges in the protocol and how people coordinate around this. If this actually ends up working really well, we might port this back to reactions and allow reactions to be more flexible in the future, but that is a separate proposal and we'll consider this once this gets some mileage. Cool, that's the high level. Any questions on this or any feedback or comments?
Can you just go back for a second to the types of links that you were envisioning? Follow endorsed.
Cool. Any parting thoughts before we jump back? All right. So this is in draft stage, so we'll give it one more week for feedback. So if you have any like other work that it might actually make it to the next protocol release in 7.12. But we're going to try really hard to get it into this release as early as possible. Other thing to note, I called it out here in the release process, but even though it releases, let me bring some, even though it releases on 5/31, for 2 weeks after a release, old hubs and new hubs run side by side. And if new hubs have follows and old hubs don't have follows, they'll keep syncing and they'll keep thinking that they're not fully in sync. So what'll happen is, even though the feature ships on 5/31, we'll actually wait the 2 weeks for the old hubs to shut down and fully turn off. And then we'll start accepting links so that sync works as accepted. So 6/14 will likely be the first date when you can actually publish the follows to the protocol, and when Warpcast will start trying to publish follows. Cool. The next big one, so those are the 4 things we're working on for permissionless hubs. The next big one is permissionless signups. And this is placed as an FIP today, but it's probably like multiple FIPs, and there's sort of one document where this is all evolving. So I want to provide a little framework for how we're thinking about what the high-level goals are and the sub-decisions that we'll have to make, each of which will probably be its own sort of decision point. So the high-level goal is we want users to be able to claim identities and names for very low cost, ideally as close to free as possible, as long as there's some guarantee of security, particularly around the ownership of those identities. The second goal is we want users to be paying for storage. So, we don't want it to be possible for users to create free identities and then store like gigabytes of data on the hub, which could be spam or useless data, which would make it impossible for all of us to run hubs because they would get clogged up pretty quickly. So even though identities are cheap, storing lots of data on the hub will cost money, and we still need to figure out what those details are. The third requirement is that users should have reasonable recovery systems. This is not something the protocol will enforce, but it should be easy for applications to be able to build recovery systems, whether using smart contract wallets or whether using like a contract level recovery system, so that if a user forgets their seed phrase or forgets their sort of the key to their accounts, they're always able to go back and recover it in some meaningful way, and they don't churn as a user because they've forgotten their accounts. Those are the 3 goals that we're working on. And then we've kind of split out 4 decisions that need to be made more or less in sequence in order to figure out what our strategy is. So the first decision is whether we do address-based identities or integer-based identities. And there's a section down at the bottom of this spec that talks a little bit about it. And so the general idea is that, like, today we're in a world where we have integer-based IDs. So every user that signs up gets an ID number like 2, 3, 4, 5, and that ends up being their ID, and that's tied to a key pair, and that's how they sign their messages. There's an alternate proposal where we can use address-based FIDs. So the nice thing about this is you can actually start with just your address. The requirement here is that you must deploy a smart contract to that address in order to actually make it recoverable. So address-based FIDs are really powerful because you can get started without making a blockchain transaction, which is really nice because you might be able to save the initial 25,000 gas. But they are a little more complex and they require more of a migration. And there are a lot of work for apps today because applications will have to like update all of their databases and data structures from address-based IDs to indexer-based FIDs. So if I were to summarize the benefit of IDs, low work, easy to migrate between different chains. Address-based FIDs, it's a lot more work initially. So there's sort of a high one-time migration cost. But it has this nice benefit of certain types of wallets end up being cheaper to deploy by around 25,000 gas. Currently, as it stands, a little more research is needed, but I'm leaning towards integer-based FIDs because I think it will make it a lot easier for all our applications. And especially if we end up picking an L2, the delta of 20,000 gas is probably not worth everyone having to spend like 2 to 3 weeks to upgrade all of their systems to make everything work. And we sort of generally believe that gas scaling will take care of the marginal cost of that. But if you have feedback or thoughts on this, particularly around wallet designs and whatnot, feel free to post it here. The general idea is that like, no matter what scheme we pick, applications can have whatever wallets they like, right? You can have end user wallets, NPC wallets, 4337 counterfactual, you can do whatever you want. But the properties of those wallets and the costs you will have to pay to set up those wallets change slightly based on whether we do integer or address-based FIDs. Cool. Any questions on that? Okay. So we will try to finalize that this week. I'll have a more final proposal on what we're doing here. And as I said, I'm leaning towards integer-based IDs. The second order decision is how does storage work and what do we actually charge users for it? So that's what I'm going to be working on after this proposal. And the general goal is we want it to be cheap so that it encourages users to post messages. But we want it to be just expensive enough to discourage like spammers from flooding it with like gigabytes and gigabytes of data and having no repercussions. So we'll probably come up with some scheme where some amount of money accrues to the protocol and there's a contract where you periodically pay a certain amount of fees, and that will be the primary the most expensive payment mechanism in the smart contract. The third order decision is which blockchain we're using for identity and storage contracts. So we're based on like a lot of the recent data around L2s, we're leaning more towards using one of the L2 systems. And we're going to spend a little more time researching the different trade-offs between security, cost, scalability, et cetera, and come back with an actual proposal for where the identity contracts and the storage contracts live. They may live on the same chain, they may live on different chains because they have different security needs. And then the final decision I think we'll make is like, what's the system for issuing usernames? As I mentioned in the article, I think we're leaning towards like starting with off-chain issuance, which will make them effectively free. So they can be ENS names that are resolved by a server. We'll kind of just port all the existing names over there and they'll be off-chain. And over time, you can actually bring them onto an L2 or an L3, which actually makes them more usable. So the cost for using names will go down to basically zero. In some of these cases, the cost to claim identities will also go down, and the cost for storage will kind of remain similar to what we've envisioned so far. That's the high-level decision. We're going to work through this. I think it will take until the end of the May to figure out what the identity system is, and then we'll spend June, July, August, like actually implementing and shipping all of this stuff and doing the migrations. And we're hoping by September, we'll actually be in a permissionless mainnet state. We'll have a more concrete timeline once we actually finish the plans, because that's going to inform the amount of work that we need to do. And we're hoping to get to that by, at least by optimistically the next Dev Call, but pessimistically the call right after that. Cool. I know I just covered a lot of stuff, so let me pause here for a minute to see if people have any questions or feedback on any of this stuff.
It's a general comment. And maybe I'm just a little jet lagged, sorry, but the speed seems a little fast on a couple of things. And the specific comment to me was when you went through the thing on links, I was like, oh, did I miss something? Like, was something I posted last week? Like, I think we had the call last Thursday. And then I was like, oh, did I miss something? And then I went and searched the Telegram group, and I saw like the links was posted today actually. And I felt like on the call just now, it was like discussed as if it was something that like had been strongly considered and everyone debated back and forth and like had given input on. But I realized, okay, no, it was just a few hours ago. I'm actually not that late to it. It's just that it's just moving very fast. And I don't know, I'm like, I would love just to be able to have time to digest it and provide actual feedback.
Sure, that's why we've got a week. Like, this is the plan we talked about in the call last Thursday. So last Thursday when we left the call, the proposal was we'll come back with a draft by next week for follows. We've come back with a draft for follows next week. We've got a week for comments. We're open to comments. Nothing about this is controversial. Everything about this is what folks have agreed on.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's just dialing feedback that I was like, in my mind, I was like, wow, did I miss something? The way it was presented. And do you think realistic that publishing follows May 31st is realistic?
So as I said, I think our aggressive target is May 31st, and our less aggressive target is 7/12, and it depends on how some of these things work. So we don't yet have a confirmed timeline.
Okay. And then I think you mentioned. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I think you mentioned that the current thing is if you get the published follows by May 31st, that the being able to write follows would be about 2 weeks later. Is that correct?
That's right.
And what's the delta on that? Like, what has to happen between?
So the way hub releases work is like when one release of the hub goes out, a lot of hub operators are still running the older version. So let's say we drop the new installation on 5/31, it takes people a few days to upgrade. So we have a system in place today for every release that you're allowed to run the old hubs side by side for 2 weeks. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, the old hubs will shut off and the new hubs won't talk to the old hubs. So we have this sort of guarantee that 2 weeks after a new release, there are no old hubs in the system. If we start sending follow data to the new hubs as soon as the release is out, the problem that happens is the new hubs and the old hubs will try to sync, and the old hubs will say, oh, you have messages I don't know about, give me those messages. They'll get the follows, and then they'll say, I don't know what to do with the follows. So they get stuck in the sync loop where they'll keep churning. And so we want to wait. We will basically have code in there that says if date less than 6/14, don't accept follows even on the new hubs. But after that date passes, now we'll accept them so they can sync and settle all across the network. So generally the system is designed for like, hey, if you have a backwards incompatible change, then you have a 2-week delay period for when the feature goes live after the release of the hubs.
Thank you.
Cool. And then the FIP like should cover most of the details. So like, Jason, again, if you have any questions, we're happy to respond to all of this stuff in line or asynchronously. But I think for the most part, none of this is very controversial. It's all very vanilla and similar to what we described. Modulo some flexible string types to allow people to put in like new types and play around with this if they would like to. Cool. I want to get to the features now. So this is the sort of third and last priority, and we're going to try to do these as we can. For a lot of these, there's no concrete timeline yet because they're still very early in the idea stage. But the three that we wanted to talk about today are first ENS support in hubs. So today you can, in theory, infer someone's ENS using their verified address. So you can kind of say like, hey, this is the person's verified address, and then you can go use a blockchain explorer or like an API and try to figure out what it is, and each client can provide it. There's a lot of cases where that's a little messy. It's actually hard to reconcile with the actual data coming out of hubs and so on. And so what we actually wanted to do was provide a mechanism where ENS would become a first-class citizen in hubs, and there would be an API where for a given user, you could ask, what is this user's ENS name? And the way we're thinking about doing it, we will most likely go with option 2 here, but pending feedback from the ENS team and a couple of folks. The user should verify an Ethereum address with the verification. So this is kind of the thing you do when you log into Warpcast and then say, I would like to connect an address. You then post a message to the hubs. So apps should handle this automatically, where you say, hey, this is the ENS name I would like to use. And what hubs do is hubs will use an ENS resolver package, which has a lot of logic to deal with off-chain ENSs. And there's a lot of fancy stuff in ENSs, but hubs will just use that package to go and say, okay, you have this address, you wanted to use this name. Do you have this name? And then they will fetch that name. And then every so often, maybe every day, they will revalidate, hey, is that name still set to this address? Because remember, for these off-chain ENS names, you can like change it later and they will get disconnected. And then they will keep updating it. And if at any point that name doesn't resolve, i.e. you've changed the ENS name to point to a different address or to resolve to a different address, the hubs will expire your user data.username message and say this is no longer valid. This ENS name is not owned by this user. And then applications will all get this little notification saying, hey, this ENS name no longer points to this user. So it's a simple-ish user experience. All it requires is you connect a verified address, which most people do today, and then you explicitly choose this is the name I would like to use, which is important because you may have multiple ENSs, or you may not want to automatically set an ENS to your name. And so those are the two things that you need to do, and we think this approach will work reasonably well for folks.
Varun, why not just use the primary ENS that people can set themselves at ENS?
What do you mean by primary ENS?
So if you go to, when you go to ENS, you can log in on ENS and see all your ENS names that you have, and you can set one as your primary.
So what system, where does that get published to that we can pull from?
That's the reverse record lookup.
So the only challenge with the reverse lookup, where you just go to an address and look it up, is those reverse lookups are not verified. So ENS calls this out in their own documentation that like anyone can I believe anyone can take like their address and say, I would like to point my address to the ENS, and you have to do the double verification anyway. So we have to do the forward verification anyway, then we might as well just do the forward verification, which seems easier. If I'm understanding how this works correctly. But yeah, Jason, if I'm missing something and there's like an easier way to pull this that you guys are using in AirStack, feel free to like message me after this. I'm happy to look into it. But we ran this by the ENS team and Greg, and they both seem to agree that option 2 was the most durable and secure way of doing this. But again, open to suggestions on other ways to optimize this.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like some of it might just be a little overkill. It's definitely more fail-proof. It might be a little overkill in the near term. Did they give you any indication as to how many people are actually, how much of an edge case the kind of off-chain ENS is?
So there's two edge cases. There's off-chain ENSs that people may want to use, and I don't have concrete data on this. I didn't get any like clear data from them, but like by definition, off-chain ENSs, you don't know how many there are because they're resolved off-chain. So unless you go and like ping each one of these, you don't know how many there are. The other thing that is also slightly complicated is names issued with a new name wrapper. also have some subtleties with them where like previously, if you owned an ENS name, it was just a 721 token in your address. Now it's a 721 owned by the name wrapper contract that resolves to your address. So you got to make sure that that resolution path also works correctly.
Yeah.
And so the goal for app developers is while there is more complexity and steps in here, what we wanted to do was push this complexity into hubs. So all an app developer has to do is to basically say, hey, I will tell you the hub what ENS name I would like to use. And the hub does all the logic and says, great, this is a valid ENS name for this person. And if that ever changes, the hub comes back and says, nope, you can't use this name anymore. This no longer resolves to an address that this person has. So the interface exposed to app devs ideally is super, super simple. And the complexity of resolving them is actually moved down into the hubs.
Yeah. And I'll just tell you already what we're launching on Jam. It's either hopefully tomorrow, latest will be Monday, but hopefully tomorrow. Is that based on the connected address that users have, we're going to show their primary ENS. And what we found is that most Farcaster users have one.
Cool. I mean, I think that's a valid like first cut approach, and I think for some large majority of people that will probably work fine. But Greg might be a good person to ask if there are edge cases. I know he spent a decent bit of time thinking about ENS resolution that he's working on.
Yeah. Dan's talking.
Dan, I think your mic's not working for some reason. Okay, we'll keep going, and then feel free to jump in if your mic is resolved. So the next thing, David actually proposed this idea that I really liked around sub-communities. I think it's still in the very early stage, but David, I'll let you. Sorry, I don't know why this isn't opening. I'll let you pitch this idea if you want to unmute and jump up.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Basically, what I think is one of the biggest opportunities right now for Farcaster is to provide an opportunity for sub-communities to organize themselves and to cast specifically within that community. So I think Purple is a good example, but there's also topic-based communities and a lot of other communities that I think as an app developer, it's insufficient to try and extract topics from casts. A lot of casts are short, and it's non-trivial to say a cast is about Purple or not. And so I think there's two parts to this. One is how does it make sense as part of hubs or the protocol to have this abstraction. The second one is if you cast into one of these sub-communities or you attach some sort of sub-community label to a cast, how should clients handle that? Should it I think links are interesting because they might allow subscriptions to these sub-communities. So instead of just following people, you can follow other things like topics. And so I think that could work well here as well if there's a good way to connect those things. Because then I think we can like boost the signal for a lot of people. But in general, I suggest this. I'm not sure exactly how it should be implemented. And so I'm looking for feedback of different people who have opinions on how this should work. Being mindful of like, you know, I as an app developer probably don't want people to input like 5 tags for content. But I think part of it is like how do we collect the information from users? And I think like posting into one sub community is fairly easy because you can show a community on your app and then allow people to sort of message inside that community and therefore attach it. But yeah, I'm looking for input. Dylan, you raise your hand.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess like as context, someone in the community actually reached out to me recently saying they have this idea that's basically like subreddits for communities, which at first would just be, you know, can you get everyone interested in songs or NBA in a space that they can chat with each other, and then even think about, you know, same way a subreddit can customize the page. Can you customize it? Can you maybe token gate some conversations? So I think some of the thinking in my mind would be, if this becomes a protocol level feature, then there would need to be similar like integrations configuration. So maybe, I'm just saying this as an example, David. Maybe you as Discove want to say, oh, we're gonna add this tagging, and then we're gonna add all these extra features. We're gonna add token gating. You can change the background color, but maybe then Warpcast, their only implementation is a sort of hashtag feature that you can search, kind of like a keyword hashtag. So I think the thinking is, do you want it to be a smaller baseline feature that everyone in the ecosystem adapts to, or do you want it to be something where just one client starts thinking about like the UI features, and then as that starts to take shape, other clients can think about, do we want an implementation like this or a little less than this in our apps as well? I'm not saying that's a perfect answer, but that's kind of what I've been thinking is how much do you want to push the kind of the UI around it?
Yeah, I go for it, Varun.
I was going to say, just to build on that. So I think there's one sort of foundational layer that already exists today, which is that casts and reactions can actually be replies to strings, just empty, unbounded strings, and they can be whatever they wanted there. Casts can also have embeds that are strings. So one of the things that you can put in a cast is an unbounded string, and it can say whatever it wants. And this, I think, is a powerful primitive that lets us build onto topics, where if the app developers all sort of agree on, well, what is a topic and what does that look like when it's a string, then you can say like, hey, so to use David's example here, we can kind of say tag : / cars means I'm talking about the topic cars. And if we all kind of agree on that, then each app can say, okay, this is what I will do with topics. I will make it searchable by that topic. So if someone types the keyword, they show up automatically. I'll make a separate feed with that topic so that, these posts can show up in your main feed, but if you go to a topic specific feed, they show up in that feed. So that's on the embed side. On the reply side, I think the cool thing that's possible is, I think the protocol I think the convention for apps should be, if someone takes a topic and embeds it in a cast, that means they want it in their main feed and then to also show up in topics. But if someone replies to a topic, then they explicitly don't want it in their main feed and they would like it to be in like a topic oriented feed. And I think that separation is nice because it allows people to have conversations that are sort of off to the side, like side rooms, but it also allows people to broadcast things that are topic related, and then apps can kind of handle them as however they want. The part that I think we need to figure out, which, there's a naive approach and a very fancy approach, is how complicated or what is the format for these different topics and how much work does it create for apps to handle them. And ideally, there's some Pareto optimal amount where apps do a little bit of work and get a lot of flexibility for their users and a lot of interoperability. So, just saying tag : / a string, and that is the tag, is very simple, very basic, is very nice. You can get fancier, as David pointed out, and you can do like /film / cars and add lots of metadata, but then it just creates more overhead for app developers. So this is the part where I would love to get feedback from people building apps on, is like, what is the right level of specificity that allows you to build useful things without creating a ton of undue work for your clients?
One thing from our perspective, like from Warpcast perspective, is I'm quite bullish on, and we already have this in the protocol to a certain degree with NFTs. But you can imagine taking any smart contract cape, like I think that would technically be an extension. But the idea that if you actually reply to a smart contract, you can by definition actually have some implicit token gating, right? It's not going to be enforced at the protocol level because actually like the cast, like we're not going to like permission the cast, but it actually is relatively trivial for a developer if you understand what's happening on Ethereum to then actually say, oh, does this cast come from an FID with a connected address that has actually a token from that smart contract? And so it actually makes it very easy out of the box, so to speak, if you can kind of just parse Ethereum to actually create a gated community, right? So I think, especially in a world where maybe L2s are also supported in the sense of things like you could imagine the way to actually create a token gated or just frankly gated topic is you put a smart contract, and then that becomes a point where you have a little bit more control. Whereas I do think this is actually pretty powerful in the sense of how wide it can go. But I do think that there's going to be challenges of like, how do you as a developer manage in a kind of post permissionless world? I'm just spamming a whole bunch of topics. This is like Twitter's problem with hashtags. So I'm not saying that like that shouldn't be the reason we do this, but I just want one thought on that, in that I do think in a permissionless world, moderation, which is hard at the protocol level, how do you effectively make it a usable experience for other clients is a thing to solve for here.
Yep.
I
Cool.
also think about the same way that Dan has. that we have NFTs and we have on-chain contract interactions, and I think we can do a lot with that. I think the missing, and so from that we could do, let's say, token-based filtering. The token-based gating is the harder part because of the public nature of casts. And so then I think when the next question would be is like, do you have like a different type of cast, whether it's an encrypted cast that's be unlocked by having that token, or a different type of messaging, say amongst, you know, just like the people with that token. But I think those things could come after experimenting first with different types of on-chain filters.
Yeah, the way I'm thinking about it is just given how the protocol is designed today, now not to say that we can't improve it in the future, like Jason's mentioning, is there's no restriction of where you can go cast. And so I think that the simplest is the fact that Ethereum is natively integrated at the hub level is for a developer, it becomes really easy, is you can actually be a control of a topic by virtue of being in control of a smart contract and then issuing NFTs to people, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's a simple V1 of it's not going to be encrypted data, but it's public data that even though other people are potentially replying to that smart contract, it's trivial for a developer to just filter out all the noise, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are some harmful effects of using smart contracts as topics, where
You went on mute, David.
it said I was muted by the host. But I think if you look at Reddit, like Reddit has a problem where these moderators that control subreddits and are sort of if you make smart contracts topics as suggested, I think there's the possibility that people sort of create the topic at the beginning, create the NFT, and then can sort of become dictators of like all of the community, right? So I think there's some balance there around using NFTs or smart contracts for topics.
I actually think of it slightly different though, because the smart contract itself is going to be some unintelligible thing. So it's not like you got the monopoly of like F1 or NBA or music. Instead, what you actually do is you have to kind of will the smart contract into kind of a shelling point. So it's almost like a Discord server in the sense that like, if you become too bad, what people are going to do is it's actually very forkable. It's like, oh, I know all the members of the people who have this NFT. I'm going to airdrop them some new one and then actually spend time trying to convince. So I think I do think that I mean, it's not all solved. So like, I think there's a lot of iteration there, but my sense is it's an extremely powerful primitive because what you've effectively done is you've created a group membership in public that is limited and controlled by a contract, and you can come up with governance systems for it, and it's like very composed.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of exciting properties of it. I think there are some things that might not be as good for, and like having, you know, all the photographers having a place to meet. There's very strong network effects around these communities, right? So like if you start a couple and then you control them, you can rent seek on them, right? You can just start charging for the NFTs once it's big, and you're sort of stuck in this local maximum where, you know, trying to move the network effects of 1 million people subscribe to this one topic that has rent seeking is too great to like shift them over to something else.
Yeah.
But I agree, there's a lot of interesting things you can do around communities if you do use it.
Okay, let me add a point here. I actually think there's value to both approaches, and I think the smart contract one is super powerful. The topic-based one is very simple. I think the thing we should try to do is get one click deeper on what the implementation would look like and what the experiences would look like for both. And I would love to get a pulse on like how does Warpcast versus Jam versus Discover versus other apps think about this, and see which one is actually going to get more traction and more usage and optimized towards shipping that approach first. Because if everyone comes and says, hey, we want smart contracts and we'll do this, then even though it's more complicated, I'm more likely to go ship that. But if people are like, hey, the topic-based one is super simple, this will actually allow us to ship something fast, then we already have the strings in place. This is by the way, zero code addition to the hubs. This is purely a application level convention that app developers agree on to do things. So from a hub shipping perspective, there's no work for us. We just all have to agree on a way to express this data so that it's useful to each other.
Is there a way for us just to run multiple experiments? I mean, like Dave, could you run an experiment in your client that uses a tag-based system like this, and we'll run one in Jam that uses NFT-based one, and we see where we get to?
Totally. I mean, I think the strings are open and everyone can run them. The only question is, and I don't know the answer to this across different clients, is if David today puts a string in, is that going to show up on Warpcast? I actually think Warpcast will say unknown reply, and I actually don't know how it will show up in Jam. So I think that's the thing we should make sure of before we run experiments, is that like if one client starts doing it, I think it's fine if it's hidden on other clients and they don't know. But if we start seeing a lot of like unknown stuff, it's just kind of a crappy user experience.
So just to be clear, and I'm happy to share this offline afterwards, we are working on right now to properly support FIP2 in Warpcast as a pattern. So the idea is if you do reply directly to a link or an NFT, that necessarily won't show up in a feed, but there will actually be a valid URL. If you click on the reply link, it will actually show the parent. And so you can kind of start to see how it's done at the hub level, like any of that data. And I think that could be a useful pattern for at least understanding, like in a world where replies can exist to strings that are not casts, like how can clients actually go handle it?
Cool. Any last comments on this? It sounds like the action items are, David, I know you proposed this. I'm happy to support with feedback. We've got our hands a little full with getting the other FIPs out, so I may not be able to contribute in terms of editing until maybe June. But happy to provide feedback if you want to rush ahead with this. Also happy to help support more actively in June once some of these other things are landed.
Yeah, that sounds good. I agree that there is possibility for clients to experiment. I think with Warpcast having the vast majority of the distribution, it limits some of the experimentation area. But I think if we discuss like how Warpcast would handle unknown strings and it makes sense, then that would be good enough to experiment with.
Cool. Last topic is, we actually won't spend too much time on this, but this is just more of an FYI that this is coming down the pipe, is we're working on an open graph schema for how different sites can express on-chain content when it's represented by a website. And so what I mean by this is if you go to a Zora page and the page is about an NFT and you share the page, it's nice if Zora includes some open graph tags that say, hey, this is about contract X. And then clients can then enrich that with other interesting things like a link to the Etherscan page, a mint link, et cetera, et cetera. Warpcast already has like a very basic version of this that works for some narrow things, but from the Farcaster level, we wanted to take this out and make this a standard that all clients could use. Super early, I haven't started on this yet, but just directionally, this is one of the things that I'm going to be on. Okay, if that's it, we've just got some shout outs and other things. Greg's been doing a bunch of great work supporting with the ENSFIP, lots of support on the indexer, which has been great. Everyone who's been running the hub has been super helpful. Any last questions before we go on? Sorry, Jason.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so I kind of alluded to, we're launching a whole bunch of stuff on Jam tomorrow. It is a departure from Warpcast in a few ways and from other things that have been in the protocol. Would love just everyone to give feedback and let us know if any of it you'd like to, have us think about how we'd work into the protocol. We just kind of just been like running off in our own direction on a couple of things that are different. Hoping to launch it tomorrow. I think latest will be Monday. It'll have some stuff with ENS. It'll have some more stuff with NFTs. It lines up with some of the stuff Dan was talking about, and then maybe stuff we all can collaborate on. We're happy to find ways to work into the protocol as well.
Cool. Yeah, as soon as you guys have specifics on what those things are, happy to take a look and opine on how to bake them into the protocol if it makes sense.
Yep.
I wanted to ask super quickly, and I'm sorry if you covered this earlier. I know that Shane recently put together this replicate hub data to Postgres example. I'm curious if that's more so something to just show off. Hey, if you want local data running, if you want to start playing around with hub data, this is something you can use, or if you're thinking as well that this is potentially like a starter kit that people could start using as an indexer, similar to Greg's, because I know that the hub branch, which I've actually been kind of working off something similar for casters. Okay, starter kit. That's what I saw. David just put that in the chat. But yeah, that's what I wanted to ask.
I think it's closer to a starter kit. I think the thing that we realize is that like everyone has like slightly different infrastructure needs in terms of what the actual configuration is. So it's hard for us to build a one size fits all. But what we did was like using JavaScript and Postgres built like a very simple, here are the patterns that you should think about as app developers. Here's the life cycle of a message, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a new developer that's just starting to tinker, you should probably copy this and slowly extend it over time and then migrate to the indexer. As a developer that already has a mature app, you can probably just use this as a reference and borrow ideas and bring it into your own application. And that's kind of how we envision it today.
Gotcha. That sounds good, and it's been very helpful as well. So thanks for kind of getting that done, and shout out to Shane for that.
Cool. He's not here today, but I will. Oh, he is here. So he can receive your thanks directly. Sweet. Last thing, a couple of calls for help. If you are running hubs and if you can have cycles to set up a hub, we'd always appreciate feedback. If you're willing to work on more gnarly RocksDB performance research or the EIP integration, we're always open to open source contributions and happy to help and support. And that's it for me today. I'll pause here for one more minute to see if there's any last topics, and if not, we will wrap up. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.